Dialed In Angling podcast presented by OnX Fish, Arneson's Rocky Point Resort, Strike Master, and 13 Fishing. Hey, welcome back to this week's podcast. You know, as we near Labor Day weekend, we've got the state fair going on. We got a full moon right now. And as we get towards the end of the month and into August here, you know, my mindset for this week's podcast is I wanted to talk about trolling and how trolling is an intricate part of a lot of aspects of fishing, especially on the Great Lakes. You get out to the Pacific Northwest, any sort of reservoir throughout, you know, the upper Midwest, it still is a very intricate part of catching fish. You know, last fall I was out with Marcus Quam. We tried casting at a bunch of walleyes. They just weren't having it. As soon as we put the trolling rods down, we started catching fish. And with me spending a ton of time on the Great Lakes, especially Lake Superior over the last month here, you see all the trollers out there and you see the trollers catching fish. And yes, I like casting a fish, but I also like trolling. And I want to talk about my history of trolling and why trolling is an intricate part of me guiding for walleyes in particular. You know, I want to roll back to the early 2000s when, yes, I trolled, but it was mainly like braided line, shallow water trolling. I did some deeper trolling with some deeper diving baits, but mainly with braid. Now, in the early 2000s, I want to say 2007, 8, maybe 6, somewhere in there, the PWT came to Mille Lacs Lake, and it was in August. It was, I believe it was their championship at the time. Not a whole lot different than the NWT championship that's going on right now out in Sakakawea. But this particular tournament was on Mille Lacs in August, and I know the bite had been really up and down because I was guiding and I was talking to my Uncle Gary, Todd Frank, you know, a bunch of guys that were fishing the tournament at the time. And I was kind of telling them where I was finding fish, where I was finding bigger fish, how I was catching them. And at the time, I remember it was in August because, you know, the bite was really up and down. I was catching a few fish on the mud flats, but I was getting a few in the rocks when it was windy. Just kind of the fish were kind of all over the map. And what I remember in particular about this tournament is it really opened my eyes to open water trolling. It opened my eyes to leadcore trolling in particular. And for me, this was my first opportunity to get information from a few of these guys, especially after the tournament. And I sort of did a deep dive into leadcore trolling. And every minute I got that I wasn't guiding, and even when I was guiding, I was experimenting with leadcore trolling. And, you know, so let's back up to the tournament itself. There was a guy named Ron Seelhoff that ultimately ended up winning the tournament. He was one of the best trollers on the circuit, on the PWT circuit. Heck of a fisherman. You know, died some years later from cancer, some complications of cancer, but was an amazing angler. And I remember he won the tournament, and I was looking at like the In Fisherman Walleye Guide afterwards, and I was following the tournament circuit very well. But I remember reading the article afterwards, and, you know, the bait colors he was using as far as the bleeding olive, shad wraps and the perch colored shad wraps. And he was trolling the open water basin. And where he won the tournament was like out by 4 and 5 mile gravel, kind of that no man's land. That for me kicked off this whole new realm of Mille Lacs Lake trolling and of Mille Lacs Lake in general that I hadn't explored. That open water basin trolling that I had largely ignored. I was a structure fisherman at that point. You know, I was pulling bottom bouncers. I'd rig, I'd jig, I'd cast in the shallows, I'd bobber fish, and I would troll shad wraps, shallow and deep, but only with deep divers. And I had never experimented with smaller baits with leadcore. And now at that point, I had learned how effective leadcore trolling can be. And one of my real mentors is another angler that's now passed on. His name was Steve Bissett. And Steve was a really good troller. He won a lot of tournaments trolling. As a matter of fact, him and my Uncle Gary were like really best buds. And when it came to fishing techniques, you know, they shared a lot of information. And I know, Gary shared over the years a lot of information with Steve and Steve with Gary. back and forth. I know Steve won the RCL. He won a lot of tournaments trolling. And, I started asking Steve questions about leadcore trolling after Ron had won that PWT tournament, as far as speed and depth and what type of leadcore. I remember driving down to Cabela's or somewhere to buy 18-pound leadcore after that tournament was won, and really just getting set up with the right rods, the right trolling rods and everything. I mean, I bought reels. I did a complete deep dive because at that point, I remember it being really up and down, and you were at the mercy of Mother Nature in August, much like you were like a year like this year. I remember that particular year, or right around that time period, we had an August where it was like a kind of a drought year, and things were really warm. And I remember I was struggling as far as patterning fish from day to day. Like I said, one day I'd catch them shallow with bobbers. The next day I'd get them out, sort of with bottom bouncers on the mud. But it was just really inconsistent. And as soon as I started trolling leadcore, I started catching fish. I remember catching my first fish on leadcore off the edge of a mud flat and thinking, wow. And this is a real realm of possibility. And the interesting part is I started trolling off structure first and doing quite well. As soon as I got information from Steve and some other anglers where I got my depths down with my speed, the amount of leadcore to put out with the exact speed I should be trolling. As soon as I nailed that, then I started experimenting with baits, finding number 5 shad wraps, number 7 shad wraps were really, really effective because that's what the fish were feeding on. And that's the beauty of leadcore is you can get these smaller baits down to diving depths that you can't normally achieve on their own, right? Unless you're using a snap weight or something like that. But leadcore is very speed dependent. And so every turn you make, every time you speed up, even wave surges or using boards, there's a lot of movement on your baits with leadcore. And so those baits surge forward, drop back. And as we know now with forward-facing sonar, fish and walleyes in particular chase baits for a long period of time. And so I started trolling leadcore. I started getting really good at it right away. And it was because the learning curve was cut in half by some of these other anglers, Steve Bissett in particular. And so, I was going out there, and now as a guide to have a tool like leadcore trolling or trolling in general, I just got to be a better troller those few summers. And I spent months, basically this time period, mid to late August, but particularly in August in general, and September until things cooled off until October. It really catapulted my career as a guide, as an angler. It made me a well-rounded walleye angler because I was not just a one-trick pony. I could fish live bait. I could fish plastics. I could fish hair jigs. I could cast. I could troll now. And so it gave me not only a boost as far as my guiding, and I was putting in I was catching a ton of fish. At the time, it was 4 fish limit on Mille Lacs. Things were booming. This was before things got overturned as far as limits being reduced and stuff. This was back in the day when it was limits like we have now, even more liberal. 1 under 20. I think it was even 1 under 22 for most of August, but it was a 4 fish limit. And I was catching limits and limits of walleyes. Plus, I was putting big fish in the boat. I was getting really, really good at trolling, the nuances of trolling, knowing when to speed up my baits, when to slow my baits, when to use boards, when to use suspended baits versus down on the bottom, watching my graphs. The Lowrance electronics had really kind of ramped up at that point. I think I had X113 or something, but it was a really good 2D sonar unit. Side imaging was just sort of coming online, and I could see fish in side imaging. And so I knew what depths to set my baits, and I really took off from there. Honestly, trolling made me a better angler, made me a more confident angler. Again, I was able to kind of get unhandcuffed from structure fishing, and I felt confident trolling anywhere. And I got really good at leadcore trolling, but I also got good at running flat lines with braided line behind the boat. I got great at running line counters. I was good at speed. So I want to break down a couple of things that I want to talk about leadcore first of all. When we get through leadcore, I want to talk about some baits, some different things that you can do now. I want to talk about incorporating forward-facing sonar into trolling and how I believe that once we get through this sort of honeymoon casting phase of forward-facing sonar, you're going to see a lot of anglers start leaning on some trolling practices to cover water. Because me as an angler being out on Lake Superior and casting to a lot of fish right now, I can see where I could incorporate some trolling techniques into catching fish out there, but then also being out on some of the Dakota reservoirs, Oahe, even talking about Sakakawea, breaking down some trolling techniques that we can use with forward-facing sonar is sort of been on my radar, and I've been experimenting with it a little bit here after being out with Marcus Quam last year on Oahe and being very successful with some harvest shads and that sort of thing, some minors. We'll get into that in a minute here. Let's take a quick break. When I come back, I want to break down kind of my go-tos when it comes to leadcore. I want to talk about speeds. I want to talk about boat control and boat control in general when it comes to trolling. And then we'll talk about baits, lures, incorporating forward-facing sonar, all of the above after this. Stay tuned. We got more dialed-in angling after this. Arneson's Rocky Point Resort in northern Minnesota offers a little something for everyone. Nestled on Lake of the Woods South Shore, it provides easy access to 14 remarkable reefs. Serious anglers know that Arneson's offers some of the best fishing, charter fishing, and small boat fishing options, all supported by the largest protected marina on the lake's South Shore. Accommodation selections range from 1 to 5 bedrooms. Equipped with all the modern conveniences, guests can enjoy a delightful dining experience and stunning lake views at the Rock Harbor Lodge, an on-site, full-service bar and restaurant. The two beaches provide hours of fun for the whole family. Whether you're seeking an idyllic fishing spot or a relaxing vacation, Arneson's Rocky Point has everything you need. Check them out at arnesonsresort.com. OnX Fish is the best tool I have ever used for finding new lakes to target. Quickly filter lakes by species, then select trophy potential, high abundance, keeper potential, or high stocking effort to find the fish you're after in the size and the numbers you are trying to catch. Download from the App Store today to get research tools for the serious anglers and beginners alike, giving you the data to target the right lakes and the confidence to get there. Use tools like recent imagery, fishing hotspot data, or the best-in-class weather features that call out current wind, weather, barometer, moon phase, majors and minors, along with precip and more. OnX Fish is a phenomenal tool both on and off the water for discovering new fishing opportunities, many of which you'd never known existed. Download OnX Fish Midwest today, the app that is changing the game on ice and open water. Okay, I want to break down leadcore trolling in general. Okay, I started leadcore trolling, like I said, in the early 2000s. Had a couple good mentors, like I mentioned, Steve Bissett and my Uncle Gary, a few others along the way that really kind of catapulted me into this trolling category where I was a guide, so I was on the water every day. So I was going to be able to experiment with baits, with rods and reels, line counters, all of that stuff, right? And so I will say the first thing that you need to do if you're going to troll leadcore is having the right rod reel combo, right? Leadcore takes up a lot of line space. It takes up a lot of line capacity on your spools. So you need a big bodied spool. You need to go back to those big body, straight line reel counters, anything that has a counter on it, but that has the line capacity to hold at least 5 colors. Okay. I know a lot of trollers out there use some really big reels. There's varying brands out there, but look at a lot of the Great Lakes reels that you can look at. a lot of even saltwater reels, but they need a good line counter and they need good line capacity. That's what you need first. Believe me, I tried putting them on some old like Garcia 6500s. I put them on 3500s, the old like sort of Abu Garcias. They weren't big enough. I needed bigger reels. I needed something that would hold a lot more line. And the lead core that I use and that I've used for years is the 18-pound lead core. It's segmented into different colors. So every 10 yards is a different color. So every 30 feet is a different color. So a lot of people say, wow, you don't need line counters when you use lead core. But I'm going to tell you why I like line counters, because you can be a lot more precise. Plus, when you're putting out a lot of lines and you're looking at a lot of different colors, it's easy to lose track. Hey, am I on the second color? Am I on the third color? Am I on the fourth color? Etc. And when you're putting out a lot of different lines, you're going to need that. Now, I've always used the Suffix 18-pound lead core. What I love about Suffix 18-pound lead core is the fact that it is very distinct different colors. Some of the lead core I experimented with back in the day, the colors, the segmented colors, just weren't that different. And what happens is when you're trolling a lot, the dye from the line sort of fades into the water. And so your reds turn into pinks, or, after basically lead core line has a lead sleeve in it, or I'm sorry, a lead in the middle. It's got like sort of a Dacron sleeve on the outside, and it's color coordinated. So like I said, every 10 yards is color. Well, if you have a red and a pink, a yellow and a light yellow, they sort of bleed together a little bit. Plus they bleed out where the colors fade over time. And yes, I change my lead core out probably every year or so, but if you don't have those real distinct colors where it goes from red to black to white, like Suffix does, it's very hard and it's very easy to get confused on how many colors you have out there. So having said that, having that line counting reel plus your lead core plus the line capacity is going to help you when it comes to lead core trolling. Now, the next thing is the rod setup. Something I like trolling rods. Back in the day, I designed some 9/6 trolling rods, some lead core rods that had a real soft, flexible tip. Okay, something that's going to have a lot of give, something you can run a board on, but have good backbone. Some guys run downrigger rods for their lead core. I didn't really like the downrigger rods. I just felt they were too flimsy. Downrigger rods have some good backbone, but they're real parabolic. And although I wanted a rod with a really good tip, I didn't want something that was as parabolic as a downrigger rod. So built my own rods back in the day, built some lead core rods that I felt had good heavy backbone, a really good strong long handle that fit in a rod holder properly, and then something that would absorb the shock of a board but wasn't parabolic enough to run a downrigger. So that basically that's the gist of the rod. So if you're looking for trolling rods, I would recommend anything that's sort of above 8/6, especially if you're going to run them out to the sides. Now, some anglers prefer to use those short little trolling rods if they run them out the back. I still do the same thing when I'm trolling. I like shorter rods that I run straight out the back. The ones that I run out to the sides, I tend to use a little bit longer, 8/6 or above, up to 10 feet. That's the rod. As far as the lead core, again, Suffix 18-pound lead core. And then I use a mono leader. Now, the reason I use the mono leader is just because of the fact the lakes I fish are very, very clear. Trollers in general, I'd say the great debate on trolling is how long a leader to use. Because I remember guys that fished the Mississippi River, that fished the Rainy River, that fished out in Erie, only used a 6-foot leader. And a lot of them used a braided line on their leader versus monofilament. I like to use monofilament. The reason they liked using braid or fluorocarbon instead of monofilament is when they were on Lake Erie, when they were on the upper Mississippi, when they were somewhere, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, whatever, it had zebra mussels, right? And they didn't want their line cut by the braid from the zebra, or get their line cut like the monofilament from the zebra mussels. So they relied on braid. They relied on fluorocarbon back then. Here's the reason I like monofilament. when the fish are finicky, they're coming up slashing at the rear hooks of the baits. There's no give when it comes to lead core. There's no stretch, right? It's just solid. And so depending on your rods, depending on what you're using, if you're not using like a 10 pound or a 12 pound monofilament, there's no give there. There's no stretch. And when you're fishing crankbaits, you have so many fish that come up and hit the baits, and if there's no stretch there, you miss them, right? We call them pullbacks. You see your rod, boom, bounce back, and then the fish is gone. Okay, because they're hitting it at 2 miles an hour, or 2.5 or 3 or whatever you're trolling. They're hitting it and coming off. The reason I liked monofilament was the fact that there was give in the line, right? There was some stretch there. That fish would come back, it would load up, and it would hook up properly, and you wouldn't lose as many fish. Now, where I agree with other anglers is if you're bumping the bottom a lot, you're getting a lot of deflection bites, whether you're trolling the river, trolling down current, or whatever. Great Lakes, even on Lake Erie, your bottom rods, you don't want monofilament because it's instantly cut by zebra mussels or debris or rocks or that sort of thing. In that case, yes, I go to a fluorocarbon leader. Now, the other debate is how long your leader should be, because when you're on the river, when you're in Lake Erie, any sort of stained water, a lot of those guys will only use like a 6-foot leader. Whereas on Mille Lacs Lake, and here's where some of the advice from some of the old anglers like Steve Bissett and some of the guys came into play, was Steve's like, you got to run a longer leader. You got to get your baits away from that lead core line. They can see that line. And so Steve turned me on to running 20-foot leaders on Mille Lacs. Now you have to adjust as far as how deep your baits dive versus a 6-foot leader, but I'll get into that when I get into speeds and trolling and boat control. So back to my line conversation. When I'm on Mille Lacs Lake, when I'm on real clear bodies of water, especially when I'm chasing suspended fish, I like monofilament. Okay, 10 pound to 12 pound mono has plenty of give with a 20-foot leader. You can get your lead core away from your baits. You don't have to worry about line visibility. And with that monofilament, you're going to have hookup percentages are going to be much better for you. There's a little bit of stretch there. You're not going to be breaking off. You don't have to worry about that stuff. There's a lot more give. And so that is sort of what I use for open water trolling. But one advice I can give for you, so you know which ones are your mono rods and which ones are your fluorocarbon rods, because I'll rig up a 20-foot fluorocarbon leader if I'm trolling baits that are going to hit the bottom or close to the bottom, okay? Especially if I'm near the gravel, if I'm by the rocks. A lot of times, I'm trolling not just off structure, but on structure in the rocks. And when I do that, I want to make sure I have fluorocarbon leaders in case I bump the bottom. And so my advice for you is labeling your rods. Right on the butt section, I'll put a M12, M10, an F10, and F12. So standing for monofilament, 10 or 12 pound, fluorocarbon, 10 or 12 pound. This will help you keep it straight. On the butt section, I just put a little piece of masking tape and take a Sharpie or a pen and just write that information on there. That'll help you keep your rod straight as far as what you're using. Now, let's get into a little bit of speed conversation, boat control conversation, and just overall trolling information in general. In addition to having the right rod reel combo, you need to be able to get your baits out away from the boat at times, okay? And so I highly recommend getting boards. Some really easy, simple boards that you can use and I'm not sponsored by any board company, but Church Tackle for years has made boards. As a matter of fact, over the years, my Uncle Gary helped develop some Church Tackle boards for them, as far as different ones that have flags on them, for example, so that if you get a bite that's triggered, the flag will actually pop up or down based on the board itself. And then they have a little quick clip in the front. And so you can run your line out there. Let's say you're trolling 3 colors of lead. You go to the end of your third color, not counting your leader. You clip your board on there. You send it out to the side. Now you can stack lines. So if you're in the Great Lakes where you can run multiple lines, if you're on border waters, if you're in the Dakotas where you can run multiple lines, it's really nice to be able to manage lines with trolling boards. The other thing trolling boards do for you with leadcore is any sort of wave movement or turn, it gives you surges with your bait. Remember I talked in the beginning about how leadcore is really speed dependent, but there's a lot of movement to your baits, and that's why it's a lot more effective than some other ways like downriggers for triggering fish, is the fact that your baits are moving a lot. So if I'm trolling a number 5 Shad Rap, I'm trolling it straight behind the boat. If I'm not pumping the rod and there's no wave action and it's dead flat calm, if I put them out there on boards, as I'm turning, those surges of those baits are going to be a lot more pronounced. The other thing boards give you is if you're trolling your baits up high, like I said, spending a lot of time on Lake Superior with it being really clear, I can see with forward-facing sonar, when I get close to these salmon, when I get close to these lake trout, they dive, right? They get boat spooky. Same thing happens with walleyes when you're casting at them. Well, that's why you have the boards out to the side. You control over the tops of these fish without spooking them with your boat and motor, and you're going to catch a lot more fish. And I'm telling you right now, there's times where I have boards out every day when I have customers, and then I have straight lines behind the boat. If the boards start popping off, I start stacking more boards. So in the sense that instead of having 2 lines out to the side, I'll put all my lines on boards because I know that those are catching fish. I've had it when I'm in the wind too, where they're surging really well in the wind, and all of a sudden every fish we're catching are on boards. That bite is attributed to that board. And so putting and stacking more boards out there, you're just going to catch more fish. And there's times too where they want it straight behind the boat. And if you're noticing too where they're hitting the boards, especially when your boards are surging, what you can do with your straight lines, instead of just keeping your rods in the rod holder, what I'll do as a captain is I'll hold the rod and I'll kind of pump it every once in a while, drop it back, kind of walk the dog with the baits. I do this a lot more when it's dead flat calm out, because when there's waves and you're quartering the waves or you're riding the trough or you're going downwind, you're getting a lot of surging. Even if you don't have your baits on boards, you'll watch your rods, they'll pump back and forth, right? You get a lot of movement to your baits when there's wind on the lake. When there's not wind on the lake and it's dead flat calm, I do a lot more of pumping of the rods. I'll do a lot more of stacking of the boards. Either way, an essential part of trolling is having the right boards. And yes, like out on the Great Lakes, a lot of guys will run a mast, so you can really stack a lot of lines. They'll have a big trolling mast on the front. You can look into that. There's tons of YouTube videos you can watch. But sort of the easiest boards are those small little rover boards, they call them. But Church Tackle makes them. Yellowbird, there's a bunch of different brands out there that make boards specifically for trolling, but you got to get those. So in addition to a line counting reel, a good rod, the right type of lead core, you've got to get some boards. Another effective part of lead core trolling is maintaining your speed. And so if you don't have a kicker motor, if you don't have something where you can maintain your speed or get your speeds down right, what you're going to want to do is pick up a trolling bag. They make these smaller drift socks that you can put off one side or the other of your boat to kind of reduce your speed. The other thing that you can help with speed is your trolling motor. Your front trolling motor. It's amazing. Today's trolling motors, like I run a Minn Kota Quest brushless motor, for example, with Norsk lithium batteries. I could essentially troll crankbaits just with my trolling motor when it's dead flat calm. I wouldn't even need to use my big motor, and I would have enough battery life to do it for most of the day, if not all day long, for 12 hours a day, just because that brushless motor doesn't use any battery power. And those Norsk lithium batteries, I have no problem. I could probably troll for 2 days straight without charging. That's how effective it is. And that's how little battery power that Quest uses. I know every day I check my Norsk app and I have an app on my phone where I can Bluetooth to my batteries. And after a day of running hard with my trolling motor, like on 10, when I'm searching down lake trout, when I'm looking for walleyes in the basin, whatever, I'm still at, 90%, 85% at the most. That's after running all day for 10 to 15 hours a day, right? I could essentially troll with my trolling motor. But if you want to use your big motor, if you don't have a kicker, get yourself a trolling bag. They make a smaller trolling bag. You hang it off one side or the other. It helps slow your speed down. It maintains your speed better, especially when it's windy out. I'll use my trolling bag even if I can maintain my speed. But let's say it's really windy out and I want to quarter downwind or ride the trough. It'll help with those giant wave surges, especially when you're going downwind. It'll slow you down to the point that you can maintain your speed. Other people use power poles, power brakes on the power poles. That will help you slow down. I've seen trollers doing that as well. But maintaining your speed is key to having successful trolling, not just with lead core, but any sort of trolling. Knowing your speed, knowing your diving depths. Now, let's get into some diving depths when it comes to lead core trolling. A good reference for trolling and a good speed for trolling if you're just getting started is sort of that 1.8 to 2.2 miles an hour, especially this time of year. Yes, I troll a lot faster and I troll a lot slower depending on the time of the year. So when things really heat up, I've had times where 2.5 to 3 miles an hour with lead core out is super, super effective. But for the most part, my trolling speed is that 1.8 to 2 miles. 1.8 to 2.2 miles an hour. Now, depending on how much line you have out there is going to dictate your speed. Plus, like I was saying earlier, the leader length has a big factor as far as how deep those baits will dive, especially if you're using baits that dive a lot deeper than others. So let's say a number 5 Shad Rap on a 20-foot leader is going to dive a lot less than like a gold miner, which like a gold miner 20 or a husky jerk 14. That's going to pull your line down a lot more than a number 5 Shad Rap. So you've got to take that into account a little bit when you're calculating your speeds. But I'm just going to give you a ballpark for, let's say, running a number 5 Shad Rap with a 20-foot leader behind one color of lead at 2 miles an hour. So I'm cutting the distance in between 1.8 and 2.2, going exactly to 2 miles an hour. So if you're trolling 2 miles an hour, each color of lead that you have out, not counting your leader, is going to give you about 6 feet of diving depth per color. Just use that as sort of your ballpark, okay? And yes, some baits dive deeper than others, even baits of the same size. And so you have to know that when you're trolling. If you want to get really good at figuring out your diving depths, go to Mille Lacs Lake, pull up to a gravel bar that's sort of flat on top and put your baits out to the side, right? And let out, let's say it tops out at 21 feet, right? You put out 3 colors of lead with your 20-foot leader. If you start bouncing bottom, you know exactly where that bait's running. Okay, it's very simple to do that. Another way to do it, obviously, is bumping bottom. But another way to do it that I've been experimenting with is obviously using my forward-facing sonar to track my baits. We can get into that in a little bit here when I talk forward-facing sonar with trolling. But really, if you kind of go off of that 6 to 6.5 feet of diving depth per color at 2 miles an hour with a number 5 Shad Rap, you're going to be right in that ballpark. Now you start upsizing it to a number 7, you might get 7 feet of diving depth per color at 2 miles an hour. But if you stay in that realm of 1.8 to 2 miles an hour, referencing those colors, the amount of line you have out there, you're going to be in the ballpark and you're going to start catching fish. I tend to run my baits above fish. So if I'm seeing most of my fish at 21 feet, I'm going to run 3 feet of colors, three colors of lead core out behind the boat. If I'm seeing the fish at 24, 25 feet, I might run 3 1/4 colors out. And that's where your line counter comes into play as well, because each color of lead is 30 feet of line, 10 yards. Okay. So if I run 10 more feet out, I can see that on my line counter. I can do more precision trolling with a line counter than I can without a line counter. Now, if you're trolling with lead core and you don't have a line counter, you can still get away with it and ballpark it. What I like to do then, and in that scenario, is take your segmented color of lead, measure out 10 feet, put a mark with a Sharpie, go to the next 10 feet, put a mark with a Sharpie. And so now you know exactly where every 10 feet of lead is. And I've done that a lot over the years where I'll measure out my lead. I know a lot of the old tournament anglers said that the colors weren't exactly 30 feet, and they wanted to be a lot more precision than that. And so that's why they relied on the line counters, but they also marked out their lead. And so that was an old secret from some old trollers. And so marking out your lead, knowing exactly how much line you have out is pays huge dividends. Now let's factor into your equations some of your deeper diving baits. Okay, so using deeper diving husky jerks would be a HJ12, HJ14. It could be the new Gold Miner 30, the Gold Miner 20. That's going to pull a lot more lead, and that's going to throw your equations off quite a bit versus a number 5 Shad Rap. And so with those type of baits, you're going to either use your forward-facing sonar and shoot backwards, which I've done on a lot of occasions now. You can shoot backwards to see where your baits are running. There's some other companies too that you can put an inline device that's Bluetooth, and it'll tell you your diving depth. But forward-facing sonar for me works really good. You can point it backwards. I actually have a 62 deucer, so I can see my baits that are out a long ways behind the boat and track those baits. What's cool about introducing forward-facing sonar to trolling is if you do have forward-facing sonar in your boat, whether it's one in the front or one in the back or both, here's how I use forward-facing sonar. Here's how I use side imaging to determine where my bait should be in the water column and where I should be fishing for fish. And tracking down fish is much easier. And this is where I think sort of trolling is going to come back into major contention. And when it comes to tournament fishing, but also just fishing in general with forward-facing sonar. Here's what I learned fishing with Marcus out in South Dakota. He had an ice bundle that was right next to his helm. He had it pointed backwards towards his baits. He had his forward-facing sonar on his trolling motor pointed forward. We would track down the fish with forward-facing on the front. He would see the fish out to the front, say, okay, they're 21 feet down over 30 feet of water. We had the baits out to the back. We could crank up our baits based on where we're seeing the fish in the front. And then as we went over the top of these fish, we could track the fish to see if they'd hit our baits. Now, we knew quite instantly if we went over a couple fish, if they didn't hit a particular bait, we swapped that bait out for another bait. Okay. At that time, we were using the Gold Miners. They dive pretty much on their own. So we were tracking those baits behind the boat and watching fish strike those baits. The Gold Miner 20, the Gold Miner 30, they dive 20 to 30 feet respectively, so you don't necessarily need lead core, and we weren't using lead core that particular day, but we were tracking baits. And if you go back and watch that segment, we're using some snap weights to do so. Really, really effective way to not only track down fish with the forward-facing sonar out front, but then to watch the fish either strike the baits in the back or not strike the baits. Where this is going to be a major, major tool for anglers, especially tournament anglers, is the fact that back in the day, I had to experiment with tons of lures, right? If you ever fished with me, I had a ton of Shad Raps laying out. I had a ton of other tail dancers, husky jerks. I had a wide variety of baits always laid out on the boat because for me, I always wanted to know if a bait was working or not, if it wasn't working, because you go through so many colors, you go through so many profile baits. If something that I had put on that didn't work that particular day, I would lay it out, and I would lay it kind of right on my electronics console back in the day, or on the top of my dash. That way I knew exactly what bait we tried that didn't work that day. Okay. Then I wasn't confused. Like, hey, did we try the parrot? Did we try the parrot color? Did we try the purple decent? Did we try the number 7? Did we try? I knew exactly what baits we ran. Well, now, because you can watch the walleyes either strike or not strike. If they follow it for a long ways, they don't want it. Something, if they're keying in on it, but they're not striking. Now maybe it's color related. It could be something simple as a size profile. Going back to my original, conversation or mention of lead core, the reason lead core is so effective is the fact that I can get these really small baits down to whatever diving depth. I remember one year on Mille Lacs when ultralight crankbaits came out, number 4 shad wraps, number 4 jointed shad wraps. One year or for a couple years, and this happens a lot. I can see it happening this year on Mille Lacs. When you get a ton of young of the year perch, they want that really small profile bait, right? And so using a number 4, using an ultralight shad, I can get that down to whatever depth I want with leadcore. Now I can target fish with baits that they're already feeding on. They love that young of the year, that really small profile bait at times when you have a big uptick in perch hatch or something. I can remember years where that number 4 was like my go-to bait for the entire month of September. If I didn't have number 4s, you weren't catching them. But I can also remember other years where we didn't have a good perch hatch and they wanted bigger profile baits. They were feeding on bigger perch. They were feeding on smaller Cisco's, kind of like last year. And so you needed those bigger profile baits. You needed a number 8 shad wrap. You needed a number 9 shad wrap. You needed number 12 and number 14 husky jerks that were in a Cisco color, like a black back with a silver body, or a blue back with a silver body, or purple descent. They like that in cloudy weather when Cisco's are all over the water column. And so matching the hatch, if you will, with the baits back in the day, you had to run through a ton of colors. Now that I can point a forward-facing sonar unit backwards and watch my baits, now I can cover a ton of water. I can target fish. So, back in the day, you'd have to troll. You couldn't target fish that were off to the side, or you didn't see that they were there until they went past you with side imaging. Now, if I see them forward and they're up 100 feet, I have time to compensate my boat to troll over the top of them. Then I get to watch them with forward-facing sonar pointed backwards. Now, you can take one of your ice bundles. If you've already got a forward-facing sonar unit on your boat, on your trolling motor that points forward, now you just have to figure out how to get a unit, an ice bundle, whether it be like a Larmac 360 or some sort of mount. I have a Lund boat, so I use the Sport Track system to mount like an ice bundle on the side of mine. Now I can point backwards. If you have multiple ice units, you can have them on either side, and now you can watch all your baits at once, okay? If you have co-anglers with you, your kids, they can watch the baits. It's really fun, really effective way to catch fish. I know some people are listening to this right now are probably thinking, man, that's crazy to think about that many forward-facing sonar units. But if you want to cover water quickly, if you want to have a spread out there, if you want to get back into trolling, if you want to do it where it's really fun, trust me. After I went out with Marcus last year and I trolled with Marcus, it really opened my eyes to trolling in general with forward-facing sonar units. It sort of piqued my interest. And then it got me excited about trolling again. So I know all of us have a ton of shad wraps. I know if you've been a walleye fisherman over the years, you probably went through the gamut of, much like I did, especially if you were in that time period where it was like live bait fishing, and then you were, power corking and throwing jig wraps and throwing on 2D sonar and side imaging. And then as soon as forward-facing sonar came around, now everyone's casting. I think you're going to see this full circle moment come back to walleye fishing when it comes to trolling. Just because if I can stack lines and I can troll to where fish are at and I can target them at the depth they're at, and after a fish has seen a presentation casted to them a million times, you talk to so many anglers where even myself, like I remember when forward-facing sonar, when I was like one of the first ones to use that to cast at fish. My buddies were the same way. I know my buddies, Mitch Hackmuller, Nick Sakella, Walleye Will, all of us were using forward-facing sonar and like, man, this is effective. Like you can literally cast a fish. I remember that first year I had forward-facing sonar. I didn't use it that much in my boat, but I used it a ton in the winter. And then that next summer when I used it on my boat and I saw how effective it was, and you could cast a fish and catch them, I couldn't believe it. Well, now casting to those fish, they've had so many baits presented to them, but they haven't seen a shad wrap, right? They haven't seen. That's why you're seeing guys find out that jerk baits are so effective, right? They cast jerk baits to fish and they're catching tons of walleyes. Those fish haven't never seen a bait like that. They've seen a jig crawler, they've seen mooch minnows, they've seen swimming minnows, they've seen all of these baits presented to them. In my opinion, if you can incorporate trolling to your presentations and incorporate forward-facing sonar to your trolling presentations, it's going to be one of the most effective ways you can fish. And especially now, this time period, and this is why we're talking about it right now, is because in August and September, when the fish sort of get negative or neutral, especially on a year like this where we had a really warm summer, yes, surface temps are dropping dramatically now, but it sort of leaves those fish into all sorts of different areas in the water column, all sorts of different areas across the lake. Some fish are on structure, some are off structure. Now trolling, you can troll at 2 miles an hour. You can cover water. You can stack lines with boards. You can run multiple lines and you can watch them with forward-facing sonar, and you can track them down with your forward-facing sonar in the front of the boat. I can't think of a more effective way to go out and catch fish, but also cover water quickly. And so that's why I wanted to do this whole podcast based on trolling, incorporating forward-facing sonar, but also talk about sort of the lost art of trolling in general, but leadcore trolling in particular. Now, one thing we should talk about is straight line trolling before I wrap this thing up. If you're straight line trolling, sort of using the same rod reel combo, you don't need a reel that has that much line capacity when you're using braided line for trolling, but you need something with a line counter. Okay. And so you can get away with something with any line counter. There's digital line counters out there. There's ones that you just reset that are sort of analog. Either way, you got to make sure that your line counter is correct and that you're resetting it every time. But for me, I like to use a 10-pound braid, and same thing. I use that same sort of ratio. If I'm open water trolling, I love monofilament. It gives you that stretch. It gives you that better hookup percentage. If you're trolling the rocks, if you're trolling in areas where you're going to be bumping bottom, I use fluorocarbon. So that's sort of my equation for that. That's the type of line I use. I use Suffix 832 10-pound braid. I use Suffix Advanced Mono 10 or 12 pound. I use Advanced Fluorocarbon 10 or 12 pound, depending on if I'm fishing the bottom or fishing the top. And the one thing about open water trolling, flat line trolling, I would call it, versus leadcore trolling, is it's not as speed dependent. Okay, you can get away with trolling different speeds. Your diving depth is going to be dictated by the crankbait you're using. So if I'm using a gold miner 20, a gold miner 30, I'm going to be getting those diving depths. Here's where you get very confident in your baits and your diving depths with forward-facing sonar. If you can point a unit backwards and watch your bait to see at exactly what depth that bait is at, you are miles ahead of where I was at when I first started trolling. And now when you see a fish forward and it's suspended at, again, 21 feet, now my flat line's behind the boat that I'm trolling with braid, I crank that up so it's at 19 or 20 feet just above that fish. Boom. Instantly, you're going to start catching fish. Instantly, you're going to be successful. Instantly, you're going to have confidence in these baits. And I'm telling you what, you're going to want to expand your crankbait selection in a big way. So be careful what you ask for. I know when you go down that road of trolling, take it from someone that has a lot of crankbaits. Luckily, over the years, I've been able to work with the best crankbait company on the planet in Rapala. But I troll a ton of Shad Raps. I troll a ton of Husky Jerks. I troll a ton of gold miners, all of the above. And it's amazing how sometimes a year they want that fast wobble. Other times a year they want that slow wobble like a Husky Jerk. And so I leave it up to you to experiment. But if you listen to this podcast, trolling, hopefully I gave you some insight into trolling and I cut that learning curve. And I also maybe will inspire a few anglers out there that are solely casting to fish right now to start trolling, because that's one thing that I've been experimenting with. And I promise you, over the next 2 to 3 years, as forward facing evolves, you're going to see trolling evolve, or anglers incorporate forward facing sonar into their trolling setups and be much more effective, not only on the Great Lakes, but you're going to see it here. You're going to see a lot written about it. It's sort of, untalked about now, but I'm already seeing it on the Great Lakes. I've seen a ton of trollers go by me trolling salmon and lake trout, and they've got the arm over the side. So I know they're using forward-facing sonar probably to look for fish and then troll over the top of them. But if you can incorporate 2 units to not only look for fish, but then to track your baits, I think that's going to be the aha or the light bulb moment for a lot of people, where they go from solely casting. And I don't think casting is going to go away. It's just going to be that next evolution where now you're a well-rounded angler. You can cast to them, you can troll to them. And you can cover ground. It's going to be in those scenarios where the fish are all over in the water column. They're not just on structure, they're off structure. They're high in the water column, they're low in the water column, they're all over the place, and they're spread out. Because where trolling is the most effective, right, is when they're spread out. They're not, and I'm talking walleyes, but when they're the most spread out, they're not actively feeding on the bottom where you can, troll live bait or a spinner or cast to them. They're all over the place. Now you can cover ground, you can cover lots of different scenarios, and you're going to catch more fish. So that's my trolling rant. Trolling on a stick is what I'm going to call it for this week's podcast. Hopefully you guys get out to the state fair. If you do, swing by the Minnesota Bound booth. I know Bill Shirk will be out there, Laura Shera, all the crew from Ron Shera Productions will be over there at times throughout the fair. I know I plan on swinging by and just saying hi to the guys over there. But if you're at the Minnesota State Fair, swing by the Minnesota Bound booth. They've got all sorts of merch for you. I appreciate you tuning in to the Dialed In Angling podcast. A week from now is Labor Day. I know kids are already going back to school. But if you want to have some fun before they go back to school, load the boat up with kids. Get a couple forward-facing sonar units out. Go out to Mille Lacs Lake. Go to Leech. Go to Winnie. Head out to a reservoir in the Dakotas, grab the shad wraps, grab the leadcore, grab the flat lines, and I tell you what, you're going to put fish in the boat, and you're going to become a confident angler quickly, and probably at a learning curve and at a pace much quicker than most of the anglers before you. If you can experiment with forward-facing sonar, you get good at trolling, you're going to be the best well-rounded angler out there when it comes to walleye fishing, and really trolling the Great Lakes in general. So hopefully that gave you some insight. Good luck to fishing to everybody. I really appreciate everybody tuning in each and every week. Good luck fishing. I'm Tony Roach, and this has been the Dialed In Angling podcast.